Get down. Now. The thunder of fists against the wooden door shattered the stillness of the night. The frame cracked, hinges screamed, and in seconds the front door burst open, splinters spraying across the darkened hallway. Flashlights cut through the living room. Heavy boots stomped against the floor, and the silence of 2 a.m. was ripped apart by chaos. A black woman, startled out of restless sleep, stumbled toward the noise in disbelief. Her heart pounded in her chest as shouts filled her home, their voices sharp, commanding, humiliating, like she was prey being hunted. 3 uniformed cops stormed inside, their faces twisted in rage, their hands already resting on weapons as if the verdict had already been decided. They weren't here to protect. They weren't here to serve. They were here to dominate. They shouted at her as though she wasn't human, as though her very existence was the crime. Her body trembled, her breath caught in her throat, and every fiber of her being screamed with fear. She hadn't even had a chance to ask why before she was branded guilty in her own living room. Before I go any deeper into this story, let me pause. Because this isn't just another midnight raid. It's a moment where arrogance meets truth, where corruption crashes headfirst into justice. And if you believe stories like this must be told, then smash that subscribe button right now, hit the bell, and comment where you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness will shake you. The lights from their flashlights pierced her eyes, blinding her. Her hands went up instinctively, but that wasn't enough. One officer barked louder, spittle flying as he towered over her, pointing as though she were the enemy. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal in her own home cut deep. She could feel her pulse racing, fear colliding with anger, but she stayed frozen. They shoved past her, tearing through the living room, yanking open drawers, sweeping papers onto the floor, scattering years of her life across the tiles. The noise was deafening. The clatter of overturned furniture, the crunch of broken frames, the shouts of men who had already convinced themselves of her guilt. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, shadows of faces in the glow of street lamps, watching but saying nothing. To them, it looked like a spectacle, another raid, another black woman whose cries would go unheard. The sting of humiliation deepened. She wanted to scream, to shout the truth, but her voice was swallowed by the weight of their authority. Each moment stretched into eternity. She thought of her father's words. Always be cautious. Always expect to be doubted. Always prepare for the day someone would try to strip away your dignity. Tonight was that day. The very people sworn to uphold the law had twisted it into a weapon, and she was the target. Her hands shook as she tried to steady herself against the wall, her mind racing with the realization that these men didn't care who she really was. They ripped open her closet, throwing her clothes onto the floor. A framed diploma slid off the shelf and shattered against the hardwood. Her achievements, her years of sacrifice, her proof of worth scattered like trash at their feet. Their boots crushed her certificates as they barked orders at each other, searching for a phantom crime they were determined to pin on her. And all she could do was watch, chest heaving, teeth clenched, fighting back tears. The humiliation wasn't just in their words, it was in their laughter. The cruel smirks as they pushed her aside, the cold glares that said she was nothing more than a suspect, a problem to be silenced. The weight of centuries of injustice pressed down on her shoulders in that moment. She was alone, cornered in her own home, facing men who saw her skin before they saw her humanity. The neighbors across the street whispered, some recording through half-drawn curtains. They didn't dare step outside, but they captured her humiliation frame by frame, ready to upload her suffering to the world without ever stepping in to help. And the worst part? She knew how the story would be spun if she didn't survive this night. They would say she resisted. They would say she was dangerous. They would say she was a suspect before she was a victim. But inside her chest, beneath the fear, something else was brewing. Rage. Not just rage for herself, but for every woman who had been silenced in the face of power, for every neighbor who had watched injustice unfold and said nothing. She clenched her fists tighter, her jaw stiffened, and her eyes burned with the fire of someone who refused to be erased. The raid dragged on. Broken furniture, scattered papers, the sound of boots stomping through her sanctuary. Her breaths grew heavier, her knees weak, but her will stood unbroken. They thought they had cornered her, but they didn't know the truth. Not yet. The arrogance dripping from their voices would soon choke them. The smirks that smeared across their faces would soon fade. Because on the wall behind them, hanging quietly and unnoticed in the chaos, was the one thing that could silence them forever. They hadn't seen it yet, too blinded by their own prejudice to look closely. But soon, their laughter would die in their throats. Soon, their humiliation of her would turn into their own. And as she stood there, bruised by the weight of their cruelty but burning with unshaken strength, she whispered to herself, "Not tonight. Tonight, the truth will roar louder than their voices. Tonight, the hunters will be unmasked." The search grew more violent by the second. Cabinets were ripped open, boxes torn apart, the sound of wood splintering under the force of boots. The officers moved like predators, circling, growling, grinning at one another as though they had already won. Her home wasn't a home anymore. It was a battlefield, and she was the enemy they had decided to conquer. Her chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, adrenaline surging through her veins, her skin damp with sweat. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, each second louder than the last. Every tick was a reminder that she was losing time, that their arrogance could cost her everything. She stood rooted in place, torn between collapsing from the weight of fear and standing taller out of defiance. One officer snatched a photo frame from the table, sneering before tossing it to the floor. The glass shattered into pieces that scattered across the tiles, reflecting fractured shards of her life. She flinched at the sound, the sting of helplessness clawing at her chest. Her memories, her dignity, her humanity, all reduced to debris under their boots. And still they shouted, still they barked commands as if she were some wild animal needing to be tamed. Her fists curled tight, nails digging into her palms. The fire within her grew hotter with every insult, every shove, every crash of destruction. They didn't see her strength. They didn't see her worth. They saw only their own power, their own ability to humiliate. But humiliation has a short lifespan, and theirs was nearing its end. Her neighbors' phones glowed faintly through the curtains across the street, their cameras capturing the scene like voyeurs. Some would call it bravery, proof. But to her, it was another knife in the wound, watching, recording, but not standing for her when she needed it most. She wasn't just fighting officers. She was fighting silence itself. The silence of bystanders. The silence of systems that turned away. One officer shoved her lightly against the wall, not enough to wound, but enough to remind her of their dominance. She steadied herself, her breath ragged, her eyes flickering to the far corner of the room. And there it was, the jacket, still untouched, still hanging proudly, still waiting to reveal the truth. They were too blinded by rage to notice, but its presence filled her with a surge of energy. That jacket was her shield, her proof, her vindication. But not yet. Not while they still believed they controlled the script. She would let them dig deeper into their arrogance, let them drown in their own cruelty. And when the moment came, she would let that jacket roar louder than her voice ever could. The destruction escalated. Papers ripped, books thrown, drawers gutted. Her entire world was being dismantled piece by piece. And yet, she remained still, her silence now not weakness but strategy. Each second they humiliated her, each insult they hurled, each item they shattered, built the weight of the hammer that was about to fall on them. Her pulse quickened as they turned toward the study, the last room left untouched. She followed slowly, her knees weak, but her resolve unshaken. The night had stripped her of peace, of privacy, of safety, but it had not stripped her of power. That was the one thing they could never steal, no matter how loudly they shouted or how violently they broke her walls. One of the officers yanked open a filing cabinet, scattering folders across the desk. His partner snickered as he sifted through her documents, eyes narrowing at the sight of official seals. Their brows furrowed, their smirks faltered, but still they mocked, too arrogant to suspect what they were about to uncover. She stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling with deliberate slowness, her eyes burning into their backs. They hadn't seen it yet, hadn't turned toward the wall where her truth hung in silence. But the tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath for the reveal. The minutes crawled, but each second carried the weight of a lifetime. She thought of every moment she had endured in silence before this night, every time her worth was questioned, every time her skin was seen before her soul. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever stood in her place, silenced in their own homes, humiliated by those meant to serve. Her breathing steadied, her shoulders straightened. Fear was no longer in control. What replaced it was sharper, stronger, justice simmering, waiting to erupt. The officers grew restless, tossing aside papers that made no sense to them, cursing under their breath. Their arrogance was cracking, their certainty faltering. And in that crack, she saw her chance. Her eyes flicked once more to the wall. The jacket still hung there, silent but thunderous in its truth. A symbol not just of her job, but of the years of sacrifice, the countless nights spent building a reputation that could not be erased by the stomp of boots. They hadn't looked yet, but they would, soon. And when they did, the humiliation they tried to bury her in would become their own. Their laughter would die. Their authority would collapse. Their voices would choke on the truth they had been too blind to see. She inhaled deeply, her lungs filling with the strength of her conviction. The night wasn't over. Her humiliation wasn't the final word. The script they thought they were writing was about to be torn in half. The study was in ruins. Pages fluttered across the floor like wounded birds. Shelves stood half empty, their contents scattered in piles of disrespect. The officers moved with less confidence now, their search no longer charged with certainty, but with frustration. Their smirks had faded, their laughter had grown hollow, and in the air hung something heavier than rage, unease. They didn't know why, but the arrogance that had fueled them was beginning to falter. She stood in the doorway, silent, her arms wrapped around herself not for weakness but for patience. Her eyes glowed with a fire that none of them could interpret, a strength they mistook for fear. But inside, she was steel. She had endured their humiliation, suffered their cruelty, and now she waited for the moment that would strip their power bare. One officer kicked over a chair, cursing under his breath as his partner rifled through a box of files, his face tightening at the sight of seals and signatures that whispered of something far above his pay grade. They exchanged glances, quick, uncertain, but pride forced them to push forward. They couldn't admit it yet, not even to themselves, that something was terribly wrong. Her breathing steadied. The storm in her chest slowed, her pulse finding rhythm. The jacket on the wall hung still, its weight invisible to them, but crushing in its truth. She could feel its presence radiating through the room, calling for their eyes to find it. Every second that passed was a countdown to their collapse. And then it happened. One of them turned, his flashlight beam cutting across the wall. It froze. His voice faltered. The others followed his gaze. There it was. The dark fabric glinting in the light, the golden letters stitched boldly across the back. FBI. The silence that fell was heavier than all the chaos they had created. Their breaths hitched, their jaws tightened, their eyes widened in disbelief. The arrogance that had carried them into her home at 2 a.m. dissolved in an instant, replaced by a fear they could not mask. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not of joy but of justice. The silence that once humiliated her was now theirs, choking them, crushing them, exposing them. Every insult they had thrown, every laugh they had sneered, every piece of her dignity they had tried to tear apart, all of it came crashing back onto their shoulders. They stumbled back a step, their hands trembling, their mouths dry. The jacket didn't need words. It roared louder than their shouts, thundered louder than their boots. It spoke of power they couldn't touch, of authority they couldn't break. She wasn't just a woman in their eyes anymore. She was the storm they had never prepared for. The weight of realization bore down on them. They hadn't raided a suspect. They hadn't cornered a victim. They had broken into the home of a federal agent, a woman whose name was etched into files they could never dream of accessing, whose testimony alone could end careers, whose presence on a case spelled the end of corruption. And suddenly, the room felt smaller. Their uniforms felt thinner. Their weapons felt useless. They weren't predators anymore. They were prey. Her silence stretched, each second an eternity for them. The same silence they had once filled with their arrogance was now their executioner. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to move. The truth hanging on the wall had already crushed them. She stepped forward slowly, her feet crunching over the broken glass and scattered papers. Each step was deliberate, steady, unshaken. Her shadow stretched long across the wreckage, her figure no longer the hunted but the hunter. Their eyes followed her every move, their bodies stiff with dread, their hearts pounding with the reality they couldn't escape. The neighbors' cameras were still rolling, capturing the shift, the transformation, the poetic reversal of power. The world outside the window would see not just her humiliation, but their downfall. The men who had stormed in with fury now stood frozen in fear. The cops who had laughed in arrogance now trembled in shame. She stopped beneath the jacket, her head lifting slowly, her eyes locking on theirs with a fire that pierced through their souls. They looked away, unable to bear it, their pride shattered beyond repair. The storm had turned. The tide had changed. The hunters were unmasked. And as the silence roared louder than their shouts ever had, they realized the truth. Their careers, their reputations, their lies had just collapsed in one glance. She didn't have to say a word. The jacket had spoken for her. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. The golden letters on the jacket gleamed under the flashlight's beam, a silent verdict against the chaos these men had unleashed. Their arrogance drained out of them, leaving only pale faces, trembling hands, and eyes darting like cornered animals. They had come to break her spirit, but now it was their pride lying shattered on the floor alongside her ruined belongings. She straightened her shoulders, standing taller than she had all night. The humiliation they had poured on her was gone, replaced by a presence so commanding it made the air itself feel heavy. Every inch of her body radiated authority, not because of the jacket, but because of the truth that lived within her. She wasn't just another target of their cruelty. She was the nightmare they never saw coming. One officer's hand slipped from his flashlight, the beam wobbling nervously across the wall. Another swallowed hard, his jaw trembling, his breath ragged. The silence that pressed against them was merciless. For hours, they had filled her home with shouting, with insults, with destruction. But now, silence was their executioner, and they could not outrun it. Neighbors pressed closer to their windows, recording, whispering, their disbelief mounting. This wasn't the story the officers thought they were writing. The videos capturing every second of this reversal would spread like wildfire, exposing their arrogance to the world. Their smirks would not survive the morning. She took a step forward, the crunch of glass under her feet sounding louder than their shouts had minutes before. Her eyes locked on each of them, one by one, pinning them in place, forcing them to confront the reality they had created. Their arrogance had evaporated. All that remained was shame. They fumbled for words, but nothing came. Their lips parted and closed again, their excuses choking in their throats. What could they say? That they didn't know? That they didn't care? That they saw only skin and never the soul behind it? The truth was too heavy to escape. Their silence screamed louder than their lies ever could. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to raise a hand. Her very presence was the indictment. Every shattered frame on the floor, every overturned chair, every ripped page was evidence of who they were when they thought no one important was watching. And now, everyone was watching. The weight of humiliation shifted fully. It was no longer hers to bear. It belonged to them, crushing their pride, staining their uniforms, burning their reputations. She stood unbroken, and they stood exposed. The neighbors began to murmur louder, voices rising through the night air. Some clapped. Some shouted words of support. The tide outside matched the storm inside, and the cops felt smaller with every second that passed. They had tried to bury her in silence, but now silence was burying them. Her gaze drifted to the wreckage of her diploma on the floor, glass shards glinting around it like tears. She bent slowly, picked up the frame, and held it in her hands. The cracks running through the glass mirrored the cracks now running through their arrogance. She lifted her head again, meeting their eyes, and in that single act she declared victory. They shuffled back toward the doorway, their boots awkward, their composure gone. For the first time, their authority was not absolute. They were trespassers in the home of someone who outranked them in ways they couldn't even comprehend. The badge on their chests had turned into dead weight. The jacket on her wall had turned into their judge, jury, and executioner. The night stretched heavy, but she felt lighter. Not because the raid had ended, but because she had endured, and in enduring, she had revealed the truth. They thought humiliation was power, but true power was standing unbroken when humiliation tried to crush you. She moved past them, her body steady, her breathing controlled, and opened her front door wide. The street outside was alive with whispers and flashing phone screens. The officers froze, realizing the world had seen them, realizing their downfall wasn't contained within these four walls. Their shame was already out there, spreading, unstoppable. And as she stood at her door, framed by the broken remains of the raid, she felt no need for revenge. Justice was already in motion. Their faces, their actions, their arrogance, it would haunt them long after this night. They would never escape the truth they had tried to bury. She stepped back inside, closing the door with a calmness that cut deeper than any scream could. The sound of the latch clicking shut was final, a verdict sealed. Her home was broken, but she was not. Her spirit was intact, her dignity unshaken, her truth undeniable. She had stood against the storm and turned it back on itself. She had turned their arrogance into ashes. And now, as the night grew still again, one thought echoed in her heart. Never again. Never again would she allow their arrogance to define her. Never again would silence protect cruelty. Her story was now a weapon, a warning, a fire that could not be extinguished. If this story shook you, if you believe the world must hear voices like this, then don't stay silent. Smash that subscribe button right now, turn on the bell, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Share this video, because silence protects cruelty, but together, our voices protect justice. Stand tall, speak loud, and never let arrogance write the final word.